I think that actual perfect fade out was meant for us to begin. Thank you so much. Is the volume good for folks seeing affirmation? Thank you so much. All right, good afternoon. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Emily Hardman. I'm kind of an archivist about town at Ithaca and JSTOR, Digital Stewardship Services, and I am here with two lovely folks. We do not have PowerPoint for you. That is not because we did not care to prepare a PowerPoint. It is because we wanted to talk and focus on that piece of it. So I'm excited to bring us together to do that with our two speakers and deep thinkers here today, and to really welcome you all into a conversation about access to, visibility of, and use of primary sources within the contemporary research ecosystem. So these folks are both really interested in thinking about this work from distinct and important perspectives that I think will open up a cool space of consideration for us. And to help you orient to those perspectives we have on offer, I want to do just abbreviated introductions so you have some sense of where people are coming from. So Marta Brunner leads the Lucy Scribner Library at Skidmore College. And prior to joining Skidmore in 2015, Marta held leadership positions at Powell Library and Charles E. Young Research Library at University of California, Los Angeles. She came to UCLA as a Clear postdoc fellow and holds a PhD in the history of consciousness, which, frankly, jealous, from the University of California, Santa Cruz. And her teaching and research cover social movement history, social justice, incarceration and information access, and scholarly communications. And then we have Roger Schoenfeld, who is the managing director of JSTOR Digital Stewardship Services, launched in 2025, which for those of you paying attention is still this year. I know it's been like a really long one, but it's a fresh new initiative, a service through which libraries can manage, preserve, and accelerate processing for and enhance access to special collections and archival materials. Roger's also responsible for Ithaca's organizational strategy, and throughout most of his career, much of his work has focused on innovation and sustainability for shared infrastructure that makes possible the work of libraries, publishers, museums, and the research enterprise. So that's who we have thinking about this with us today. And as I said, our focus is really going to be on this space of archives, special or distinctive collections, and their use in the contemporary research ecosystem, which is, of course, to say, a digital ecosystem. It's one that in many ways and in many places has, at least historically, been separate and distinct from the kind of scholarly core of the library system, or at least how it shows up in many ways. Sometimes this is because materials are presented as boutique projects. Sometimes there are good reasons, copyright, donor restrictions, community care, questions of ethical display of all of these materials, and those matter. However, even when some of these issues are resolved, a majority of the collections still don't travel well into digital environments because the existing description is lacking, and many repositories don't have resourcing to resolve such descriptive gaps at scale. Last year, I led a study for JSTOR of 24 institutions in the US and the UK. It's called Bridging Capacity and Care, and you can find it conveniently on JSTOR. And one of the significant things of note across many different settings was that technical services and processing units have experienced really sustained reductions in staffing over the course of this last decade. The gaps are filled with contingent labor, with student labor, and the golden minimums of description, they aren't refined or iterated on because of constraints of time and energy. Digitization has been instrumentalized as success, while description is treated as residual work that we may or may not get to. And our study didn't measure user experience directly, but the staff who consistently connect on the front lines with users, they see those impacts, the negative impacts. Reference and support teams reckon with the cost of minimal description with these materials daily. So moving from the observations of that study, we're going to continue forward and consider some of these dynamics and issues. And we're really glad you're here to discuss, so we're going to get into it. Marta and Roger are both going to offer some framing, and then we'll dive into conversation up here, and then welcome you all in for questions and thoughts. Marta.
Awesome. So glad to be here with you all. And I'm going to start out with a quick and dirty poll. Just raise your hands. I'm curious who's in the room and what kind of institutions you're at. So I'm going to ask small, medium, large. And if you can just raise your hand. I'll also do other. So if you're like, I don't fit in any of those. So small institutions, small libraries or campuses. Okay, medium. Okay, and large. Any unicorns? Okay, we have some unicorns. Okay, great. Awesome. Well, I consider myself to be at a small library. Our campus is about 2,500 students, have about 9 librarians besides myself, and then staff. And then, so I wonder if we're an outlier in what I'm going to describe here, and I'm hoping that you'll bring in your perspectives. But as Emily said, I came from UCLA Library before this, so I also have the big R1 kind of perspective, and I know the distinctions there. So most of our special collections is archival in nature and is focused on campus history. And so from the outset, our approach to digitization has been to be as descriptive as possible, knowing that it was probably going to be in service of writing campus obituaries, preparing for presidential inaugurations, and all the things. So I'm going to give you a few examples of the ways that we've worked, and then one counterexample, two examples and one counterexample. And when I say we, it's not me. We have one person who's our head of digital projects and collections. His name is David Seiler, and much of what I'm going to say comes from me sitting down with him and saying, how do you do your work? How have you done your work? He's been at Skidmore for decades, and I'm hoping he's still young enough to stay with us for at least another. So I just wanted to let you know we're pretty much a one-man shop at this point. So the first example that I have is our campus newspaper, which is called the Skid News. Skidmore, Skid News. It was our first major digitization project. And David went through and digitized every page, OCR'd every page, cleaned up the OCR on every page, tagged and described every photo, every ad, everything that was in there. Very, very laborious, took a long time, but it's accurate, and it's heavily used. Good. And it happened before I arrived, I think. So, the second is fast forward to now, and David is working through our scrapbook collection. And we were a women's college before we went co-ed in the 70s. So there are scrapbooks from like 1913 through 1965 that he has digitized. If you imagine a photo album, a family photo album, these contain more than just photos. They've got all kinds of ephemera. And so our archive space descriptions are pretty spare. Here's the person, here's when they graduated, what kinds of things are in there. But there's not a whole lot in there in terms of description. However, the digital surrogates are so detailed. David has taken out every single fold out, every handwritten note, every inscription under a photo, every napkin, bib. I mean, there are a lot of things in there. And along the way, he's been able to identify people, places, images, events, campus knowledge that he has accumulated in the process of doing all these previous thick description efforts in other parts of our collections. And so without this rich description, we would really lose much of the historical value of these scrapbooks, because otherwise they present as like somebody's photo album, somebody's memorabilia, but just an individual, not really meaningful to the larger campus. So the counterexample I want to give you is a collection of land grants that we have from 16th to 18th century Great Britain. And while we did digitize them, they're minimally described, mainly because of language issues. We don't have the expertise. A lot of Latin, some other languages, but also it's in a specialized handwritten script, which is called secretary hand. Maybe somebody in the archivists here know what that is. But the example here, I think this is emblematic of the promise of being at a small liberal arts college, is that a history professor brought her students in, and they transcribed and described in detail a selection of these land grants. So now, at least a subset are available with much richer description. And if we can, we will backfill archive space with some of that. But the nice thing about this approach has been its focus almost entirely on the archival history of the college. And so having these digital collections really fully described makes it possible for somebody to do a federated search on the search box of our digital collections site and be able to actually make connections across the different types of collections within that space. And unexpected connections too. But this approach isn't very scalable. So for those of you who are at large institutions, you're probably going, oh my God, that's so not where we are. We don't really have hidden collections in the same way. And so that's not our problem. Our problem is more what happens when David wins the lottery and decides to leave. What are we going to do next? And what are we missing? And the thing that we're really missing and struggling with right now is born digital. So our campus does not have a digital asset management plan. We don't have a records management plan for our campus. Like, we're really behind in those aspects. So that's probably the next thing for us. So I'll stop there and pass it to Roger.
Thank you, Marta. And Emily, let me just say, I've learned so much of what I know about archives and archival work through the study that you did and other kinds of conversations that you and I have had. So I just really want to commend to everyone here, if you haven't had a chance to look at Emily's paper, it's really worth your time, and it's up on our website, so it's easy to access. Some of my experience in thinking about these issues comes originally from work that I did in Ithaca SNR before I moved over to JSTOR stewardship. This is dating us back years, 10, 15 years ago. We were doing a series of cohort projects of different institutions would come together as a cohort to look at how to better support researchers in a given field of study. And so we looked at historians in one project, we looked at art historians in another project. We did a number of these initiatives. And it was really interesting and those papers are up on the SNR website, probably buried quite a bit down now over the course of the years. But those papers were really foundational for me. The projects were really foundational for me, hearing about scholars who were doing primarily archival research, and some of the disconnects that they faced between the ways that they wanted to access and use archival resources and the ways that archivists or archives were able to make them available to them or discoverable for them. And so that sort of always stuck with me as an area that I think we've, there's always reasons why practice is the way that it is, and as leaders we know there's all sorts of constraints, but there's also a purpose to the work, and if you look at the purpose through the needs of a scholarly humanist, which is not the only user community by any means, but you can really deeply learn about, like, well, what would it take to kind of optimize that experience for that user, and we can and we should do that kind of work for other kinds of user communities as well. I'm just my grounding was in those kinds of academic humanists here. I work, Emily and I work for an organization, Ithaca, the not-for-profit organization, that has a mission of helping unlock access, expand access to knowledge and education. So, our experience in as an organization in building JSTOR now 30 years ago has been, like all about, to a very substantial degree, how to both do something that is cost effective and makes sense from an economic perspective, in the sense that digitizing journal back files was originally intended, in the very beginning of it, was originally intended to save shelf space. And it's such a kind of I mean, lots of institutions have in fact saved shelf space, whether through shared print initiatives or deaccessioning or off-site facilities, so I don't mean to minimize the importance of that. But actually, the opportunity there is around how to expand access and discovery and impact if you digitize materials in a way that they are appropriately done, so described and digitized in appropriate ways when they're made available through the right kind of platform infrastructure, when that's done through a trustworthy, organizational context. And so, from my perspective, we have like such an interesting moment right now where distinctive collections, archival materials, special collections materials, we have the opportunity to unlock access and release dormant value from those materials today in a way that is unlike anything that I think we've experienced in our professional lives. And so the initiative that we're working on, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but just to situate it, in JSTOR stewardship and JSTOR SeqLite is an opportunity for libraries and archives to use advanced new tools that librarians and archivists themselves use to address some of the challenges that we're talking about here today. So, so how can you generate item level metadata or recognized full text or all of the other kinds of things that would help you with collections processing? How can you do that at scale in a way that ultimately, for the user, produces an experience that's better because materials are more discoverable than they otherwise would be, because we have first-rate description, because we have full text available, but also to do it in a way that's cost-effective and ultimately faster so that we release value in some of these massive backlogs that many of our institutions hold that is, often an aspect of constraint. And so these materials that we're talking about here today are like irreplaceable assets and foundational materials that should be available to all to ground societal discourse and certainly scholarly work. And so there's just such an interesting opportunity in this moment where the kind of question of like what would it what are those constraints and what might it take to overcome some of those constraints is really interesting. So I could make the case that you should try this tool, like that sort of case. But I think the really interesting questions are around like how we take responsibility as organizations for these dilemmas. Where we see opportunities to use new tools or technologies, new workflows, new staffing structures. I mean, I think there's actually a lot of really interesting, that we can probably get into further here today. But institutions are under so much pressure today from so many different angles. Pressure that includes the need to get things done on short budget cycles. Pressure that includes like demonstrating maybe not an actual ROI, but like, does this investment that we're making have a payoff? Like, what is the return? What is the benefit from it? And I think that can result in us having misalignments between some of the sort of purpose that I believe all of our institutions share in terms of providing for the scholarly research ecosystem, some of the desire to make materials more and more accessible, generate greater, not just scholarly, but impact in the world through them, but a kind of misalignment between that underlying purpose and some of the ways that we're often forced to manage through what can be structures, incentives, systems that are in one way or another no longer really fit for purpose. And so I think there's a lot that we're learning in our work that I think can speak to that. Looking at libraries really across the community, where some of the observations, Marta, that you offer are like really incredible illustrations of both opportunities So you know, I guess just to wrap up the kind of opening remarks, I guess what I would say is that I think there's an opportunity to think about investments that that our community is making or maybe can make in description, which description still matters. Description, Emily, you know touched on this very directly, has value in ways that it sometimes gets elided. You know, I've heard people say, oh, oh, well, there's AI, so we won't need description, or things of that nature. And who knows where the future will take us in 10 or 20 or 50 years from now. I'm not opining on the long-term future here, but description still has incredible value to unlock access to materials, unlock discoverability to materials. And if there's a way of thinking about investments that we can make in description as a kind of strategic infrastructure for our sector and our users and our community, I think there's a way to think about what we're doing with digitization and born digital collecting. So many of us either are taking on or are facing the sort of challenge of taking on, where there's an opportunity not just to have more materials digitized, which I would argue is incredibly valuable to our users, but not just to digitize them and pop them up on a website, or face the constraints around getting that work done responsibly. But if we had that material described and discoverable in ways that truly speak to the needs of those historians, of those art historians, of our students, of a general public, that we really believe I believe is at the heart of the. I believe that the user ultimately is at the heart of the work, and so I think that the opportunity to have materials that aren't just preserved, aren't just cared for, but that actually participate fully in research, in learning, in society. Like, I think that's an amazing opportunity that we have today. So,
Yeah, thanks both. I really like this because, Marta, you're so grounded and site-based and thinking about, like, what are we doing for the community, open these collections up, and Roger, thinking at scale, like across the very small to the very large, and how we're all kind of engaging with these questions. I'm curious, do we still believe that digitization is access, or digitization alone is access? And is there something more nuanced with discovery, with access, that we're beginning to see play out, in a site-based place while you're looking across sites? What are you seeing there?
It's funny, I feel like we're flip-flopping a lot on this question of digitization. Is it access, and what's the priority? And when I was a Clear Fellow back at UCLA a long time ago, it feels like, I participated in a hidden collections project was being done by Clear. I think it was Mellon funded. And some of us Clear Fellows were mobilized to do some research on how different sites, grantees were using that opportunity to process hidden collections. And it was right when MPLP was kind of like more product, less process. I always say it backwards. And so everybody was showing us like folders with like, here's our very descriptive but concise folder title, and that is the description, and woohoo, no longer hidden. But then they would also show us, oh yeah, and we're on the side, we're doing this digital exhibit or something like that. And that feels like the digital surrogate is kind of secondary. Then it feels like we shifted into a time period where the digital surrogates were the gate, the way that people were going to come in, and if they came through our doors to look at the analog, the original, so much the better. Now it's complicated for me, and especially in light of generative AI and the trustworthiness of the digital image now is a little bit more, well, it's in question, I think, depending on what guardrails we have and how we're thinking about things. But trustworthiness of the information is at stake. And so now I'm wondering if we're shifting in this question of whether the digitization is the access point that we're going to be emphasizing. And maybe it will be. It's separate from the, just want to be clear, it's separate from the AI application that Roger's talking about, the SQLite, which is helping just like generate metadata and process huge amounts of backlogs. But so to answer your question, I'm not quite sure at this point.
Yeah, that's a very fair answer. Yeah.
I mean, if your question is, does digitization equal access? I guess my question is, what do we mean by digitization? Because I've seen versions of digitization that are, let's scan 100,000 images. We just heard, I think we were all at a lunch right just now that we heard some cases where libraries had done, our archives had done substantial, like let's scan a lot of things, but where there was minimal or no entry points, as you're sort of pointing to, into those materials. So I think by some standard that's digitization, but that doesn't, unless you are coming from a very, very predetermined sort of entry point, that's not really producing very much discoverability, let alone access. So I'm quite interested in what I see as one of the real opportunities that we have in kind of rethinking the nature of what it means to do this work in a digital environment. Like for me, it's less about there's a predetermined entry point, right? So like if I can use the journal back files as an analogy, right? There was a time when the only way to get into the journal back file was to know that you wanted to go to volume 17, issue 2, page 75, right? And many of us remember those days. Increasingly, people probably can't imagine, why would you get into the journal back file any way other than doing a search, right? And often a search of the full text. And that lets you in, not just through the 3 or, whatever number of subjects that were applied in an ANI tool, but it lets you in through any idea you might be looking for. And I think that, with archival materials, full text isn't the whole solution. I'm not trying to say that, but things can be described in so many different kinds of ways. Anyway, all of this to say, to my mind, when we think about digitization more fully, like I think that's a very different kind of access that we can offer. Anyway, did I? Yeah.
Can I build off of what you're saying too? I think that the question I've been asking myself and my team when these questions come up is, who are we digitizing for, or who are we trying to provide access to these materials? And I think for a long time, I've thought, as a library director, have thought of digitization as, we're doing this, we're putting some of our collections in JSTOR because we want to make them available to the widest possible user base. But now I'm thinking more, what are our local needs? What are the things that our students aren't going to go to archive space because they think it's just a list of names. They don't see that there's something behind it. But if I send them to our digital collections, they see something and they see a thumbnail and they're like, oh, that says Skid News. Or that says the name of our yearbook, and so given that students and faculty and some community members are our primary mission, our primary patrons, that's kind of where we're starting to make our decisions.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up that conversation with your team too. And Roger, you opened by it was just a brief aside, but thinking about reimagining staffing and the work here, and sort of opened by talking about how so many technical services and processing units have kind of been decimated across the board. This is our ones with one person doing this work. If we imagined a reinvigorated mandate that maybe connects to a different way of thinking about description and access and the digital environment. What capacities would you want to see rebuilt or reimagined and recreated in this space? Workflows might you change? If you're thinking about that in a very direct way, how would you want to see it manifested in a bigger way?
No, yeah.
Yeah. So many institutions. I mean, there are varieties, but many institutions have a model of describe first, and if you've described, then scan, then digitize. That's a gross simplification, but that's sort of often the mindset, right? Like, first process the collection to create a finding aid, and then maybe digitize some or all of the parts of it as one example. That's a workflow that's sort of taken for granted very often. It's often reflected in departmental structures. So, often there's one group of people who do the materials processing, in this case, like doing the finding aid, et cetera. Then there's a totally different set of people in a different department with a backlog all of their own who are doing the scanning. And in those cases, like there's historical and like really important reasons why things have developed that way, and some of it gets at why are you, like we've touched on, why are we digitizing? Or if we're digitizing because there's something that we want to make accessible, that's a very different kind of purpose to digitizing than if we're scanning because that's the first part of the workflow that then we're having various tools process against those digital scans. So, I think there's some really interesting questions right now about that our experience with SeqLite raises, but I don't think it's just SeqLite. I think this question of, like, when do we make something digital and why and for what purpose is foundational. If our goal is to radically expand access with users in mind, with users that we may not even be able to imagine. And I mean, that's the thing. Like, it's easy to sort of, I shouldn't say it's easy. I love the idea of saying, like, who are these users that we're trying to meet? But I think with distinctive collections, very often we may not even know, right? I mean, and so anyway. So I think the question of, like, how do we think about? So I've been talking about workflow and sort of departmental structure. I think there are also really interesting elements around sort of professional identity and professionalism in what we're talking about here. The work that people do to generate description, to think about how to strategize around digitization, to run programs around digital collections, like all of that work is professional work that has been where professional identities have been built up in one kind of set of assumptions, and I think some of those assumptions will give way. That doesn't mean that the professionals in question aren't still desperately needed, maybe in many cases more needed than ever before, but there's going to, in some cases, need to be some adaptability around, well, my work now contributes to this part of a workflow, or, for this different purpose within within a sort of larger vision. I think, I don't know. That's a hypothesis, but that's sort of directionally what I'm anticipating. We'll see.
I'm not sure I have more to build on what you just said. The only other thing that came to mind as you were talking is we've often approached digitization or access to our collections very broadly and assuming that we should make it all available. But we're starting to think more about, we've got a lot of community projects, community archives. We're working with community partners as part of the curriculum. And so now we have new questions about, we're digitizing this. Is it ours? We're working and advising a community partner on something that they're building. How do we talk with them about that? How do we think about who gets to have access to the digitized content? and maybe we need to be more deliberate about thinking those things through.
If I can
Yeah,
just say, I'm
please.
so glad you raised that because I think there are really interesting questions there about like post-custodial models, and I just think that the assumption we often make is that everything should be open, but the actuality as we dig into specific collections is that we have to be very responsible and have so much care for those materials, for the originators, for the partners. So I just really appreciate you raising that.
Yeah, this steps a little bit to the side, but I think is aligned. Thinking about the work that your team does to build new description, maybe that's not open to everyone, maybe that's not all shared, but certainly there are times when it is, right? And we know that sometimes that work, that intellectual, interpretive, historical labor, it's getting locked into very specific places. So it might just live in a digital exhibition, which we may have an MOU to carry forward for a couple years. We may not. The past is littered with these sorts of projects and full of the labor of description, which doesn't always get written back to the kind of authoritative systems of record like archive space. I'm really curious how you're thinking about sharing that work, thinking about information silos when it comes to description.
Yeah, and I talked with my head of special collections about this just the day before I left for this conference, and she basically said, like, well, ideally we would, every time there's an exhibition that uses our materials, we would take all of that description and we would put it back into archive space. And she's really also thinking about the students, again, they look at archive space and it doesn't mean anything to them. And it's a shame if an exhibition label, like an exhibit label, has more information than our description in our catalog or in archive space. And so, that's something that we could be thinking about creating new workflows for going forward. We haven't gotten there, but she also raised this interesting question about are we at a moment where we're debating what's best in particular ways that we'll look back on either with chagrin or otherwise. But she talked about being at a conference where there was a lively debate about the best formats for images, and they were deciding between JPEGs, GIFs, or TIFFs, and everybody was like, no, it's going to be GIFs or GIFs, however you say that. And well, of course, that hasn't turned out to be the case, right? So, but it's hard to foresee what we're going to be looking back on. But ideally, what we're doing at a small liberal arts college or at a graduate institution, maybe with graduate students, is teaching them all about this stuff. Like pulling back the curtain and saying, this is how we describe an object. This is how it happens. If we're using generative AI for this, here's what it's doing. Here's what it's not doing. It's not thinking about it, but it's doing some labor. So I think that, for me as an educator, is the most important thing, is being very real with ourselves about what we're doing, and also then with, if we're at an educational institution, then with our students.
You have thoughts on this, Roger?
No, that's
okay. Yeah, you're not worried about archive space as much right now. Yeah. I'll ask just one more question, sadly, because I do want to open it up to everyone. But maybe I'll end with this and sort of say, we talked on the edges here about AI and descriptive work, and just going to sharpen that edge and kind of ask very directly about a hope or unease that you carry about how these tools and technologies might reshape access to special distinctive collections and archival materials.
Okay. So I want to answer that in two ways. So I think that there's a whole category of tools that largely doesn't exist yet, but that will allow students and scholars to really deeply interact with with primary source materials. And if any of you are familiar with the interactive research tool that we've built on the JSTOR platform, which lets you interact with like a journal article or a book chapter, the idea of being able to speak to and ask questions of a primary source object, tell me about like who wrote you, or what were some of the other things written at the same time as you. Like you can sort of imagine some really interesting use cases that I think would be valuable. I'm actually pretty bullish about this direction. I think that there are a lot of guardrails that didn't exist a few years ago in the way that AI was going to be used by students and in some cases by scholars as well, that have been large. I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about this, but I think we're starting to see evidence that there's a better policy environment put in place for that, and I'm optimistic that will continue. I do think that the question of like how those materials will be used within the consumer AI tools is a very, very different kind of question. And I'd raise that in two ways. One is, okay, you have, at Skidmore, you have some materials that have been, digitally available. If those are Creative Commons licensed and find their way into the training data of, of Grok, I don't know, will that be represented in a way that is true to its origin, right? I think it's a black box. We don't know. I think that concern is magnified in cases where libraries are being approached by those very commercial LLM services with offers to digitize or fund the digitization of distinctive collections in exchange for exclusive training access. Not everyone here may be familiar with this, but it's basically what happened when Google came to a group of research libraries and said, let us scan your books, and you can have them back and make them publicly available. And we're all very, very proud as a community of what that's achieved, and HathiTrust has been an enormous contributor to that, et cetera. I'm not diminishing any of that. And there was this little caveat that, well, Google was going to get certain rights for what I think was then called non-consumptive use. Does everyone remember non-consumptive use? But like that sort of LLM training is what they were doing with those materials, and it turned out that they had the exclusive right to do that. It didn't go to their competitors, and I think the risk that that libraries with distinctive collections, which are not like sort of copyrights and rights for published materials are a little bit different, but libraries are charged with the stewardship of their distinctive collections, and that's a heavy responsibility. Sometimes it's looking after copyright, but very often it's looking after reproductive issues. Sorry, not reproductive issues. Sorry, reproduction. And as well as thinking today about what that might mean from in terms of AI, various kinds of AI rights. And I think some libraries are faced with a dilemma between we don't have nearly enough money to put into description and digitization and ancillary tasks that we wish we had, and so if an OpenAI or Gemini or Claude or whoever says, hey, here's a lot of money, all we want are the proprietary training rights. You can make the materials open access, we just want the training rights. That can be a very challenging dilemma that I know a number of leaders have found themselves forced to wrestle with recently. And I think that question of it's not just discovery, but training. Like, is that something that's the library is going to control as the steward of these materials, or is that something that that an LLM, a commercial LLM vendor, will ultimately have exclusive control over? I think there's a lot at stake in that I'm frankly quite worried about.
Yeah, definitely. The devil's in the details, especially in those licenses, as you're pointing out. And I think the thing that I keep coming back to, and I've already mentioned, but I'll say it again, is I have to keep coming back to what's our mission. We're a small liberal arts college with a very high price tag, and we are committed to teaching students how to think for themselves, how to not take shortcuts, how to realize but stick with the research process when they realize this sometimes sucks, it's hard, I've run into walls, I have to keep searching, try new approaches, get my hands dirty. That's not always pleasant, but you learn in that process. So for me, coming back to that helps me think about, the tricky thing is academic freedom means the faculty member decides what their students are doing in the classroom, and they might come to the library and say, we need them to be using these AI tools and so on. We have conversations at those points. But for me as the library director, working with my team and helping us think these things through, that's what I keep coming back to. We are here to help students learn. Learning is not something that is well served by shortcuts that are presented by generative AI in all cases. But that's not to say that it can't serve a purpose, even a pedagogical purpose. And so we really just have to think things through very carefully and patiently. But again, I think I appreciate your point that, who is making those decisions? Is it the vendor of the tool that's going to, stand to make money off of this down the road, or is it the institution of higher education?
We have in the back somewhere an invisible support person for the room who has a microphone. Thank you. There you are. So we are recording this session. If you can speak into the mic for future listeners, that would be really appreciated. And if you have a question or a thought, something you want to advance in this conversation, please.
Thank you. Nathan Hall, Penn State. Emily, I liked earlier you pointed out how Martha was kind of speaking at the site-specific level and Roger was kind of looking at the ecosystem. So I'm going to ask a question and hope for that kind of model in the answer if possible. So with ADA Title II compliance, I'm curious how that's maybe informed, how the descriptive processing that's enabled through these tools, how that's informed your use of them to try to achieve those goals for compliance. And so if you have experience with that, Marta, and then Roger, if you can talk about how the broader community is being served or how you're shaping the direction of your development that way.
You're a prophet or a plant? That was actually the question I just left on the cutting floor here. So thank you so much for that.
Awesome. So we are a little bit behind on thinking directly about that. The fact that David, our digitization workhorse, has been doing such careful work that I'm pretty confident that ADA compliance is not going to be out hard to do if it's not already there. However, I will say our academic technology, which is not in the library, it's in IT, has been working very, very hard on our campus to try and get our LMS to be ADA compliant, to get everybody's PDFs compliant, and so that conversation is happening, not driven so much by the work that we're doing in our digitization and primary source collections.
So trying to take a cross-institutional perspective on this, my understanding from conversations that we've had with the library community is that there are such an array of different standards that a single federal law has begun to manifest. So there are, again, as I understand it, there are different sort of state, I don't know if it's state attorney generals or state policy implementation on behalf of different university systems that actually diverge from one another quite a bit. And I'm sure that in the private institutions it would be somewhat similar. So there's a whole set of it seems like there's less clarity on a single national standard than the fact that there's a single law might suggest. I'm not an expert in this, so I'm just sort of trying to reflect back my understanding here. I can share that some institutions are quite, I mean, you probably realize this, that's probably why you're asking the question. You know, some institutions are quite anxious about this issues. Others seem to be a little bit more, feel like they have it under control, and I'm not sure to what extent that's different sort of threshold standards that they feel like they need to meet, or if they're actually differently positioned relative to the work. With SeqLite, one of the things that we've seen among the library community is an enormous amount of interest in the ability, as part of collections processing, to generate recognized full text, handwriting recognition, et cetera, out of archival and other primarily text-based collections. And similarly, a huge interest in the ability for description of images to function as a kind of alt text-like interface, sort of describing what the image is. So, I think there is opportunity with things that look like description, like the alt text example sort of is description. I think the transcripts probably fall a little bit outside of what we mean by description, but similarly, I think there's opportunities to use collections processing approach, both at the point of ingest as well, I think, in more of a reparative sense. So for existing metadata that is not up to standard, or where existing digital collections may not have transcripts and so forth. So those are definitely things to think about.
Hi, I'm Matt Irwin from Grand Valley State University. I'm curious, how do you see the challenges you're talking about, challenges with kind of description for access, intersecting with what I think is one of the other really big, expensive, hard problems in any kind of digital collections, which is that maintaining and fixing and hosting and inevitably migrating digital collections is so much more expensive in terms of time and effort and expertise and money than doing that with paper. You put it in the right kind of acid-free sleeves and in a Hollander box and on a shelf in a climate-controlled space, and you're good as long as your HVAC system keeps working. Can't really do that with digital collections.
Yes. And periodically over the years, we've had people from IT stop by my office and say, so we're paying a lot for Amazon Web Services archiving or preservation. Do you still need it? It's like, so we've actually moved to Portico, and we're definitely using JSTOR stewardship services for that, and that's been very helpful for us to be thinking about that. But yeah, I mean, you raise a good point. I mean, it is a new kind of stewardship, but one that if we're thoughtful about it, we can kind of keep ahead of it. That's where I worry if I lose. As I said, if David Seiler wins the lottery and leaves tomorrow, that's where I'm not sure that. No, I don't want to cast any aspersions on the IT experts in our campus, but their minds are on other things right now, security, and so having a conversation proactively with them about digital stewardship is it's just harder to get time to think that through with them, and so that actually is something that would keep me up at night.
Matt, I've written and spoke a fair bit about shared infrastructure for the library community, and so it's a funny position to now be in, to be responsible for a piece of what I consider to be that shared infrastructure. So I have to kind of separate out. I try to offer you more of an analytical and not a sort of self-promotional take, but I think we've seen. We've learned a lot about what kinds of organizations and what kinds of practices produce more and less robust and durable shared infrastructure. And we've learned, and this wasn't obvious 20 or 30 years ago, we've learned that most all institutions can't create their own bespoke infrastructure. Like there's a huge, homegrown movement for ILS and other kinds of tools that, fairly quickly for most institutions, not all kind of, it just wasn't sustainable. We've learned that there are certain kinds of commercial vendors, not all by any means, but certain kinds of commercial vendors that pursue strategies that are more about various kinds of lock-in kinds of strategies that, often commercial vendors are really valuable because they're able to invest capital in building infrastructure. So this is no great takedown of them by any stretch of the imagination, but to get the returns that they need to get for the investment they're making, often pursue strategies that ultimately are, kind of produce some of those dynamics that you're talking about. Like it's harder than it should be to get stuff out, right? And that can be a challenge. We've seen an open source movement really blossom within the library technology community, actually maybe twice, like maybe not just once, maybe twice. And I think we've learned a lot of lessons about, it's not just open source, it's about sort of creating sustainable and durable models for not just the code itself, but how the code gets hosted, how the materials get hosted. So I guess what I'm getting at is like some of the things that feel like, oh my God, like we had this experience and then we had that experience and then we had other experience, which is all true and valid, like completely, to me feels like lessons that libraries have learned about approaches not to take. And maybe that learning isn't evenly distributed and, different people take away different pieces of the lessons, but, most people are not trying to build their own bespoke repository out of, bare metal, right? So I think that means that, in terms of the digital collection space, which is, I guess, what we're talking about today, or in your question, what you're asking about, I think there's a first generation of digital collections platforms that, some of which have been quite valuable, some of which have had some of the challenges that I've been describing. There's another challenge, which is platforms that seemed really cutting edge at one point that have received, have been underinvested in by their providers for whatever set of reasons over the course of time. And there's no guarantees, right? I mean, I would tell you, we're absolutely committed to something today and mean it, and I'd be honest about that. But I can't guarantee you, right in blood, what will be the case in 20 or 50 years from now either. But I think we've learned a lot from those first generation experiences, or at least I've learned a lot from those first generation experiences about some of the models that we're about why we're pursuing some of the models that we're pursuing. And without getting into that, because I think that kind of verges a little bit too much into like the self-promotional, I'd be happy to talk to you offline about that if you were interested, or others are.
I think we have time maybe for one kind of quick question. Yeah.
I have a really quick question. Oh, sorry. I have a really quick question. Can you repeat the name of the study that you did?
Yeah, of course, thank you. It's Bridging Capacity and Care, a field report about, I'm losing the thread, but it's something to the effect of a field report on special collections and archives.
And you're the author?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And I mean, we do have just a minute, but that probably isn't enough time for a substantive question. So we'll just thank you all and be around here. I think we're going into a little bit of a break, so happy to chat and compare ulcers from transitions out of digital, or whatever other questions or conversation you might want to have. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.